Francis King, welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. Thank you for joining us today. Who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, my name is Francis King. I am a lecturer in modern European history in the School of History at the University of East Anglia in Norwich in Great Britain. I am also the editor of the journal Socialist History, which originated from the old historians group of the Communist Party of Great Britain, as well as being the reviews editor on European History Quarterly. So I'm an academic translator and editor.
Yeah, what is this Journal of Socialist History? What's the story there with that journal?
Well, it was founded in 1993 when the Communist Party of Great Britain dissolved itself in 1991. I've been a member of it for about 50 years. Its historians group, which was quite well known, it contained people like Eric Hobsbawm, and in the past it contained people like John E.P. Thompson, and continued to contain John Saville and other prominent Labour historians. That group decided to carry on and turn itself into the Socialist History Society, and began publishing a journal. And I took over that journal in 2010, and I've been stuck as the editor ever since. But it's a sort of semi-academic, sort of academically credible, if you like, journal. So it's aimed at a broader readership than simply academics, and it's mainly distributed through subscription rather than in the online sort of way that academic journals are now distributed. But it aims at presenting the history of the socialist movement, generally fairly widely conceived, in a way that's accessible to, if you like, the intelligent non-academic.
The first thing I guess I want to ask, just because we're talking about you being an editor of the Socialist History Journal, is, what does it mean to do socialist history? What does it mean to be a Marxist historian? And what does it mean to do Marxist historiography?
It can mean a lot of things. I mean, there's an ambiguity in the title socialist history, which we exploit quite consciously. It can be the history of anything from a broadly socialistic perspective. It doesn't have to be even a Marxist one. It can just be any kind of history from below, kind of sympathetic to the subaltern perspective type history, or it can be the history of the socialist movement and radical movements generally, and we use that quite consciously in our sort of editorial policy. So it's in comparison to a lot of the stuff that's published in the United States, the journal I edit is very untheoretical. It is basically concerned with empirical history of the movement and that sort of thing, presented in an accessible way, and rather than sort of the kind of stuff that you get in sometimes in Monthly Review and such like publications, which I find kind of hard going. So we occupy that particular niche of doing basically fairly empirical and the sort of history that you don't necessarily need to have gone to university in order to make sense of.
I really respect that. I really like that. I mean, I think that, that's a really important thing to imbue when we do history, is the fact that it can have this, hyper academic bent, but it also should always and can always be something that doesn't require that. History can be made, written, and produced by anybody. And I think especially when we have our eyes on the movements and have a political position to assume. I think that's like really important and great. Um, so I guess my question for you is then, so what kind of, historical research have you done? If I understand correctly, you've researched Menshevism and social democracy, and could you just, like, for our listeners, give us a little bit of background about some of the topics that you've explored before we get to your research and writing on Georgia?
Well, I mean, as an undergraduate, I was very interested in the Russian Revolution and particularly the economics of early attempts at establishing a socialist economy. And in 1987, when I started doing research for my PhD, I was working on a fellow called Vladimir Alexandrovich Bazarov, who was one of the founders of the methodology of economic planning in the USSR in the NEP period. Who he had been a Bolshevik, but he was one of the imperio critics that Lenin had denounced. And he'd moved in the course of 1917 to a more Menshevik type position. He adopted many of the critiques that Martov and others were making of Bolshevik policy, as well as the policy of the provisional government. And he was appointed as a non-party specialist to Gosplan in 1921, and as I said, devised a fair amount of the early methodology of Soviet planning at a time when it was envisioned as, if you like, a system which would organically grow and displace capitalism on account of its greater rationality. So it's a rather different conception of socialism and of a socialist economic plan from what subsequently came after the Stalin turn of 1929, when planning was used essentially as a means of mobilization of resources for state purposes, regardless of whether it increased productivity or not. So it was anyway. Bazarov was fell out of favor from 1928 and was one of the people arrested at the end of 1930 in preparation for the show trial of the All-Union Bureau of Mensheviks, a largely fictitious organization which was one of the economic show trials of the late 20s, early 1930s in the Soviet Union. He refused to acknowledge guilt, refused to confess, did not appear in the dock, despite the fact that in the original indictment, he was supposedly one of the main organizers and the main theoreticians of this counter-revolutionary All-Union Bureau of Mensheviks. And he actually died in 1939 at liberty of natural causes in Moscow. So actually, not confessing in some of these show trials was actually not a bad move whatsoever. It was doing this research that kind of interested me, particularly in if you like, alternative models of socialist economy and the views of the non-Bolshevik socialists around the time of the revolution and in the early 1920s in the Soviet Union. This coincided, of course, with perestroika in the USSR, when alternative models of socialism become very fashionable indeed intellectually. So it kind of the two things meshed quite interestingly. The only problem was that when I finally submitted my thesis in 1994, alternative models of socialism had gone completely out of fashion. Nobody cared. What, you're still working on that old stuff? Was the kind of response. So from adopting a very sexy topic in 1987 to eventually presenting this study of if you like, a failed alternative model of socialism in the USSR in the 1920s, at a time when the whole thing had gone completely out of fashion intellectually, was a it was bad timing on my part, let's just say. But that was really what got me sort of particularly interested in these alternative perspectives, because previously when you were in the Communist Party, if you were interested in the ideology, you read Lenin and that sort of thing. You read it without any context. You never read the people he was criticizing, and he was invariably having a go at somebody or other in his polemics. And you never read it in context. You never actually read it, in the sense of what was actually going on in Russia or wherever at that time. And I found that once I was reading this sort of stuff in context and reading the people that he was criticizing, more often than not agreeing with the people he was criticizing, uh, or sympathizing with them at least, it gave me a very kind of different perspective, and sort of started me searching for alternative voices in the socialist tradition, which had been largely kind of marginalized or regarded as somehow redundant.
So for the purposes of our discussion, and of course, if we're going to talk about the First Republic in Georgia, the first thing I think for our audience is, if you're going to describe Menshevism, what was Menshevism? I know this is a big topic, but I mean, within the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, within the Russian socialist movement, what exactly was Menshevism, and what defined it as such?
Well, Bolshevism defined itself against Menshevism, and Menshevism defined itself against Bolshevism. So, I mean, that's the first thing, is that you've got these two kind of competing blocks, factional blocks within Russian social democracy. And it's always worth bearing that in mind, in the background, that once you get a factional battle going on, it has a momentum and logic of its own. It's well known that the main things that they disagreed about and split over in 1903, the definition of who was a party member and that sort of thing, and the different perspectives that the two factions had in 1905 over whether or not it was possible to have a democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and poor peasantry, as Lenin seemed to believe, or whether, as more and more Mensheviks later came to believe, that it made more form political alliances with the liberal forces in order to see about bringing about a constitution in Russia. This was in the 1900s, around 1905. One of the most perceptive comments on the difference between the two, I think, was made by a Menshevik who'd been a Bolshevik in 1905, George Denica, in an interview with Leopold Heimsen many decades later, where he said it was largely a matter of temperament. But whether or not you sympathize with the Menshevik side or the Bolshevik side depended, to a large extent, on whether the degree of your I don't know, fanaticism or skepticism or whatever. But
Wait, what did he?
I mean,
Wait, what did he mean by that? What do you mean by temperament? I mean, I kind of can understand what you're saying, but what do you think he meant by that?
I think at the time, and of course he was then speaking as somebody who'd spent a long time as a Menshevik in exile, and therefore presumably wanted to present his own cases as well as possible, that if you were all the more questioning, more doubtful, more cautious, more inclined to see the snags and difficulties in things rather than kind of revolutionarily impetuous and that sort of thing, you were more likely to side with the Mensheviks and with the Bolsheviks. So there's a degree of caution, of political skepticism, of possibly a greater willingness to compromise. But of course, whatever generalization you make about the Mensheviks or about the Bolsheviks, you can always find exceptions, because these two factions within the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, first of all, they didn't embrace the entire party. There were plenty of people in that party outside of both factions, or who sided with one on some questions and another on other questions. And of course, and this is where Georgia comes in relation to the politics of Georgia. Uh, One thing I noticed fairly early on is that virtually any generalization you make about the Mensheviks, you have to say except in Georgia. So you could say the Mensheviks as a whole disavowed the idea of armed struggle, except in Georgia. The Mensheviks as a whole were skeptical about the possibility of organizing the peasantry, except in Georgia. The Mensheviks became disoriented and lost support politically in 1917, except in Georgia. And this was something which actually got me particularly interested in the Georgian case, was the fact that almost every generalization you could make about Menshevism on the all Russia level seemed to be contradicted by what you found in Georgia, which of course, was necessarily very interesting.
Well, of course, that this then brings me, if we're going to open up this part about talking about Georgia, was they of course referred to I think it was Eric Van Ree, in one of his articles about Georgian social democracy, discusses how the Georgian Mensheviks were called the most Bolshevik of the Mensheviks. And then and then of course there are other historians who disagree with even the use of the term Menshevik to describe the Georgian social democrats who come into power in the First Republic, because they say that this is some kind of national movement that is distinct from the world of Russian social democracy. So I guess maybe this is a good opportunity to start the conversation. So you've written this article that was published a couple of years ago called Improbable Nationalists, Social Democracy and National Independence in Georgia, 1918 to 1921. And, in your article, you basically outline how the First Republic, the Democratic Republic of Georgia, was this, world's first ever social democratic government. But that the experience of the First Republic was something that, because of this Russian Civil War, nation building, started moving away quickly towards away from even the founders' social democratic and Marxist ideals into something that looked more like a nationalizing, chauvinistic, and even kind of centralizing state. And so what's interesting, I guess, for our listeners and for my own, and research into some of these questions is that, this vision or this history that you kind of outline in your article is very distinct from some of the ways that the First Republic is romanticized as being this, almost utopian paradise of social democratic experimentation. So I guess if we could just, I was hoping we could discuss this, like, what were the ideals of the First Republic? And then how would you outline this process by which those ideals get eroded and the First Republic becomes something else? And then what does it become?
Well, I think we can start with that famous dictum of Marx that men make their own history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing. And in relation to Georgia, first of all, the question of how Bolshevik or otherwise the Georgian Mensheviks were. Yes, certainly they rejected the idea of liquidating their underground organizations, which was popular amongst the Russian Mensheviks in the period before World War I. And they also retained a degree of organizational cohesion and discipline that was missing in their Russian colleagues. The thing is, I suppose, on the question of were these people Mensheviks or not, it always seemed to me that people like Nikolai Chekhyadze and Irakli Tsereteli were Mensheviks in the all Russia context, when looking at if their horizon was the entire Russian Empire. But when it came to the Georgian context, a very different context, which they knew well, they acted in quite different pragmatic sorts of ways, and particularly those Georgian Social Democrats who remained in Georgia, who didn't get particularly involved in the on the All Russia stage, but were mainly active in Georgia. Yes, they they were from a very early stage pragmatic politicians attempting to maneuver their way through the sort of particular problems that the immediate problems they found in Georgia. In the case of once the Tsar had fallen in 1917, uh, in Georgia, the Social Democrats found themselves in effectively the leading position. They found themselves responsible to a large extent for the civil administration and the organization of politics on the territory of what became Georgia. They weren't predominant in Armenia or Azerbaijan or whatever, but in Georgia they were the dominant hegemonic political force, and were having, even before the Bolsheviks had seized power, as, if you like, a state force, an organizing force, the main political force in that area, and deal with the practical problems that they found within Georgia. And there's a passage in Jordania's memoirs where he, I believe, mentions that they were having lots of problem with breakdown of law and order and looting and that sort of thing in the summer of 1917 in Georgia. So the Soviet, led by the Georgian Social Democrats, organized courts martial and shot some of the perpetrators in order to sort of try to introduce order. That sort of doing that sort of thing at that kind of early stage.
Yeah, I mean, in your article, of course, you mentioned all these different moments when, through this process of state building and nation building, that after the Georgian Social Democrats and Mensheviks have come into power, outlawing Bolshevism, repressing demonstrations, and it's interesting to me also the way that you've noted that in the memoirs of some of these social democrats who participated, the way in which they remember and write about the First Republic is actually quite different from how they presented the political motives at the moment. And so, what did you, I guess, as a historian and as somebody who was trying to understand the situation, what did you find was this major difference between the memoir, historical memory of some of the participants and the at the time political presentation of the reasons, causes, and political impetus of various decisions?
Well, of course, at the time, as a politician, you have to see about trying to bring people with you and mollify opponents or people who might sort of get in your way. And at the time, in 1917 and early 1918, before the Democratic Republic of Georgia was proclaimed, the Georgians were having to find ways of working with the Dashnak Armenians, with the Azerbaijanis and that sort of thing, in first of all an informal and then a formally established Transcaucasian Federation, at a time when all of these political forces, for different reasons, did not actually envision formally breaking away from Russia. Or whatever. They just wanted to sort of be together with well, not with Bolshevik Russia. They imagined that at some stage after the Soviet regime has fallen and everyone's come to their senses, that they could be part of a renewed democratized Russian state, an illusion they claimed at least to cling to until April 1918. Subsequently, for example, I think Grigol Orotadze sort of pointed out that they effectively declared independence long before, by their actions they had declared independence from Russia long before, if you like, ideologically they had announced that or even admitted that to themselves. So yeah, at the time, politicians are reacting to situations and you know rationalizing things to themselves in the present. And once they write their memoirs, they rationalize things to themselves with the benefit of hindsight. So all sorts of decisions which were taken at the time as a kind of stopgap or a short-term pragmatic sort of thing will tend to be presented when you write your memoirs as part of a longer-term, historical trajectory in which you kind of, particularly if you're a Marxist, you'd like to sort of give an air of necessity or inevitability to. So I think that explains to an extent the difference between the way that the Georgian social democrats in their memoirs present what they've done, particularly if they're sort of presenting it to, you know, as in some cases, the wider socialist movement internationally, rather than to their the people they've got to work with politically at the time. So I think that kind of accounts for those sorts of differences. But I think that would be common to all political memoirs, as people kind of iron out the narrative and try to put it together in some kind of logical sequence rather than in the context of day-to-day struggles and sort of balance, trying to resolve dilemmas and the sorts of things that you do, particularly if you're a politician in those sorts of circumstances in which the Georgian Social Democrats found themselves in 1918, where the state was falling to bits. They had the Ottoman armies advancing on them. They had their borders were undefined. They had Russian troops who were semi-mutinous trying to go home. They had all sorts of internal dissent within the Republic. Their economy was never really had never been conceived as an economy which was self-autarkic or self-sufficient. They needed food supplies from across the Caucasus Mountains, from the North Caucasus, and that sort of thing. It was a disastrous situation that they were dealing with. The Georgian Democratic Republic was born out of chaos and calamity, and its politicians were trying to basically ride the wave, because the alternative wasn't really worth thinking about. So yeah, and that was common. That was common to every part of the former Russian Empire, and it's one of the themes that occurred to me time and again. That although the Bolsheviks in Russia and the so-called Mensheviks in Georgia presented themselves as kind of opposites to one another, and presented each other as traitors to their common cause and all that sort of thing. In many respects, they faced the same sorts of problems, and they had to react to them in much the same sort of way. You've got a state with massively increased expenditure on military and other requirements like that you need to sort of find the resources for. Your tax base is destroyed. Your economy is in a state of free fall. What do? Well, you resort to requisitioning to a certain extent, and the printing press to print money. They did it to different degrees in independent Georgia and in Russia, but they had the same problems. They had the same kind of range of options for dealing with them. I think a point I made is that one significant difference between Georgia and Soviet Russia at this time is that Georgia, for the most part, tried to avoid internal class war within the country. So whereas in Russia, requisitioning and that sort of thing was also part of a policy of ruining the bourgeoisie, which was seen as a political goal in its own right, whether or not it was economically expedient to do that. And in many cases, it wasn't economically expedient to do that. In Georgia, it was more, if you like, more akin to the sort of Burgfrieden approach that the German Social Democrats had supported in Germany in World War One, where within the besieged fortress you tried to maintain social peace in order to sort of prevent your social situation getting even worse.
Yeah, I think that that's a really interesting point that you bring up. And, you know, in your article, you also mention another sort of big factor of the separation, what becomes this separation between the Georgian Social Democrats, the Georgian Mensheviks, and what's happening in Soviet controlled territories, which is the question of the war. And to me, this is a really fascinating thing that puts them in opposition to each other, which is that the Georgian Social Democrats essentially, you know, want the prolongation of the conflict because of their concerns about the Caucasus Front, versus the key factor for Bolshevik legitimacy and victory in the revolution is their anti-war stance. And to me, that tension and dynamic is pretty fascinating.
Well, yes, I mean, because for the Bolsheviks in Petrograd and then relatively safe in Moscow, with their belief that their revolution was just the starting point for a world revolution, which was going to resolve any potential temporary difficulties relating to the border and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and all of that sort of thing. It was all seen as, you know, temporary concessions made while the world socialist revolution was kind of on its way. For Georgia, losing territory to the Ottomans meant losing Georgia. It wasn't that you just got to, in the event by bringing the Germans in, they only gave the Ottomans a bit Batum and areas like that. But you know, there was a potential if you adopted this completely. Oh, you know, we're abandoning the war. The Ottomans would just sweep in. There's nothing to stop them sweeping in and taking the whole area. And you know, as the way the Ottomans had treated the Armenians in 1915 showed, that wasn't really you couldn't really countenance that sort of possibility. So the whole question of, you know, how you end the war is had a very different complexion in the Caucasus than it had in well, from the perspective of the Russian troops on the Western Front or the Bolsheviks or the Bolsheviks in Moscow. And the other thing is that, of course, although the Bolsheviks used a lot of anti-war rhetoric and talked about ending the war, at the same time, they'd always disavowed the idea of a separate peace until they actually signed a separate peace. If you read Lenin's speeches, you know, prior to taking power in 1917, it's fantasy. A lot of what he has to say about how they're going to get peace. You know, they'll make these proclamations, and then any government that doesn't respond to them will immediately be overthrown by their own revolutionary proletariat. But you know, there is no talk about, you know, separate peace until, you know, Trotsky's various revolutionary proclamations and have failed to have failed to have the desired effect, and they're faced with the real problem of hard military power and the fact they've got no army to resist it. I mean, it's also worth noting that in Western Europe, World War One finished pretty much on the 11th of November 1918. On the territory of the Russian Empire, it carried on until at least 1921 in one form or another. So, I mean, there's the question of the relationship of anti-war intentions and anti-war rhetoric and the actual political effect of it. And as we can see, the political effect of the genuine war weariness in Russia in 1917, 1918 was to give them another 3 years of war that Western Europe didn't have to put up with.
you alluded to something earlier about um, the relationship between the Georgian Social Democrats of the First Republic and then, of course, the Social Democratic movement in Europe. Obviously, very famous story of Karl Kautsky coming to Georgia at the time, the Democratic Republic of Georgia at the time, and then writing a book, I believe that was published in 1921 about his, or 1920, 1921 about his time. And I'm just curious, like, if you could just talk a little bit about the sort of international relations that the First Republic had, and as you know, your article Improbable Nationalists kind of goes into this distinction between the sort of ideological view of the of their vision of their own state, the way that they're kind of presenting the state to socialists abroad, and how those fellow travelers who oppose Bolshevism sort of use the Georgian experiment for their own sort of political purposes at home. Because to me, that is kind of an interesting dynamic. Because on the one hand, they're presenting it a certain way. There are particular dynamics happening at their own country. And so it's almost like the social democrats in Europe, the anti-communist social democrats in Europe, and the Georgian social democrats are both using each other to sort of promote their own political legitimacy without necessarily engaging with the concrete realities of what this nation building project in the Democratic Republic of Georgia is actually like.
Yeah, well, on one level, it's a kind of mirror image of what the Soviet Russia was doing with the proto-communist organizations of presenting a certain picture of itself, a certain image of itself, which I've no doubt its leaders sincerely held for the consumption of their supporters abroad. And the Georgians were doing exactly the same for a slightly different set of slightly different foreign audience. So, I mean, throughout, the Georgian Social Democrats continued to consider themselves to be Marxists, internationalists, revolutionary socialists, etc., and considered their aim to be the socialist transformation ultimately of Georgia, and considered their political allies and supporters to be the Social Democrats, and particularly in many cases some of the more left Social Democrats of Europe. But and any distortions in their in the reality of the Democratic Republic, of course, were, force of circumstances, temporary measures, etc., etc. The birthmarks of the old system, and all of the sort of the way in which socialists have traditionally kind of explained away some of the less palatable aspects of what of the states they run. And so, yeah, the Georgian Social Democrats were very keen to present their country to a Western left-wing audience to get that kind of external support and solidarity, which they believed was okay, if not quite as essential as the Bolsheviks' imagined world socialist revolution was for the survival of their experiment, nonetheless an important guarantor of the success of the Democratic Republic of Georgia, and an important source of support. And there was some kind of reason for that belief. It's not accidental that in 1980 negotiated with the German general staff to get the German troops in to guarantee the security of Georgia against the Ottomans. But the long-standing relationships that Jordania and others had with the German Social Democrats were certainly used to facilitate that particular diplomatic relationship. And it's been suggested, I can't remember quite by whom, to ensure that German occupation did not take the form of the particularly rapacious sort of occupation that the Germans tried in Ukraine and that sort of thing. The Germans behaved themselves reasonably well seeing the Georgian government as well, almost as partners, relatively speaking. And so, those sorts of relationships, having relationships with socialists outside of um, of Georgia was particularly important, and that's of course always been the case with Georgia. Any little country sandwiched between large polities, large imperialistic polities, has to try to find friends. But yeah, in many respects, it seems to me that this was, can be, you can draw very, very direct analogies between what Georgia was doing, particularly in 1920, 1921, trying to get this international support and recognition and yeah, a solidarity from socialists in Europe, and what Soviet Russia was trying to do. The big difference, of course, is that Georgia was also trying to get support from the established capitalist states of Europe on the diplomatic level at a time when Soviet Russia was far less interested in that sort of thing, or didn't believe it was going to sort of serve any useful purpose.
So you've kind of gone over or outlined this fact that they are basically, in a situation due to the Russian Civil War that's happening, right, which is an extension of World War One, more or less. They're trying to hold on to some semblance of non-Bolshevik social democratic independence, but they, of course, rely on the German sort of an alliance with Germany at the time to facilitate that. And also at the same time, there is this move by the Georgian Social Democrats to demobilize what were Soviet supporting soldiers in the territory of Georgia, and the arming of and the creation of what they will call the People's Guard, led by somebody whom you've written about, Valiko Jureli. So maybe we can just use this opportunity to talk about, and it seems like, well, I should say, it seems like to me that's a very, very important part of the story of this move away from some internationalist social democratic ideals into this kind of nation building exercise that will oppose the USSR, and a Soviet internationalism, and look more inwards and try to build this state. So, who was Valiko Jureli, and what was the People's Guard? And then on top of that, where do the question of the non-Georgians play into this part of the story?
Okay, well, on one level, I mean, the People's Guard started out as the Red Guard. It was analogous in many respects to the Red Guards that were formed by lots of Soviets across Russia. Um, it was it wasn't a very significant force until the 12th of December 1917, when Valiko Jureli was tasked by Noe Jordania and the Social Democratic leadership of the Tiflis Soviet to collect 2,000 rifles from the garrison in Tiflis, as it was then, in order to arm this force. The need for doing that was, as the government in Petersburg, as Petrograd at that time, had declared an armistice and declared demobilization. Large numbers of soldiers were giving up their posts on the Ottoman front, but worse than that, they were starting to move through Georgia as they tried to drift back towards Russia, in a state of indiscipline, engaging in looting and God knows what. So there was a significant public order issue in Georgia at that time, which the, the the Tiflis Soviet did not really have any other force to deal with it. So it had very little control over the soldiers. There was there were separate soldiers, Soviets, but were in becoming increasingly politically unreliable because they were largely filled with ethnic Russians and others, and were reflecting the dynamics of all Russia politics. Whereas the Soviet of Workers deputies, the main Soviet in Tiflis, was reflecting the dynamics of Georgian politics. So you had this kind of split in the whole Soviet structure, and it was a power struggle between who was going to win out, whether it was if you like, the civil Soviet authorities in Georgia, or the various soldiers Soviet organizations which existed amongst the now rapidly auto-demobilizing soldiers. Djugali himself had initially been Bolshevik in the Georgian Social Democratic Organization. The Georgian Social Democratic Organization, the RSDRP in Georgia, had remained united more or less until the late spring of 1917. The local Bolsheviks had decided not to try to strike out on their own, but to try to work within the united RSDRP organization because they were so weak relatively. And it was only at a subsequent stage they split. And at that point, it became necessary for Georgian Social Democrats who had occupied a kind of intermediate or ambiguous position, or an ambivalent position, if you like, between the different factions to make their choice. I don't know what the issue was whereby Djugali fell out with the Bolshevik faction, but there were articles in the Bolshevik, the Tbilisi Bolshevik paper Kavkazki Rabochi in at the end of 19 over two issues, denouncing Djugali as a small man with a big opinion of himself. It was so there was this fallout, whether it was personal, whether it was there were substantive political issues there. I don't know. It'd be interesting to find out. But from that point on, Djugali transferred his loyalty to Noe Jordania and the main leadership of the Georgian Social Democrats, while still occasionally calling himself a Bolshevik. One of the peculiarities of the delineations in Transcaucasia was that the very kind of sharp divisions which existed, say, in Petrograd at that time, weren't necessarily replicated across the country, and certainly weren't replicated in Georgia in the same way. Anyway, so Djugali was youngish, I think he was 29 at the time, charismatic, a good organizer. He had, I think, over a decade's experience in the social democratic movement at that time. He wasn't a kind of a new arrivists type. Was charged by the Tiflis Soviet with taking these weapons from the garrison, and because of the confusion and disorganization amongst the soldiers, somehow they managed to do it. Some of the Bolshevistically inclined soldiers tried to resist, but by that time they'd got these weapons. And from that time on, Jordania had his own, if you like, almost private armed force, the Georgian Red Guard, answerable officially to the Tiflis Soviet, unofficially, effectively answerable to Jordania for his political use. At the same time, at the end of 1917, there were attempts to try to create national armed formations in Transcaucasia to substitute for the self-demobilizing Russian armed forces, but they were not terribly successful. So you had this kind of power vacuum in which things were going to be decided not so much by democratic representation as by who could actually control a relatively disciplined group of armed men. to enforce his power. Um, the October Revolution in Petrograd had the effect of creating well, I mean, basically, it had led to Soviet power in Georgia by destroying the organizations of the provisional government, but the Tiflis Soviet was controlled by the Georgian Social Democrats, and so you had this bizarre situation where the Bolshevik Revolution had created Soviet power in Georgia and put power into the hands of a Soviet led by people who did not believe in Soviet power as a way of organizing the country, who still looked to the Constituent Assembly as the best means of deciding on Georgia and the rest of Transcaucasia's constitutional relationship with the rest of the Russian Empire, um, in a situation where the supporters of the Bolsheviks were largely unruly and undisciplined soldiers who were not proposing to stay in Georgia for any length of time because they wanted to get back. They wanted to get back home. They wanted to demobilize themselves. And in this case, in this situation, a relatively small and relatively inexperienced force like Jurgeli's Red Guard could play if you like, a crucial role in cementing and securing the power of the leadership of the Tiflis Soviet to the people around Jordania. It seemed to me I mean, I can only judge this from having sort of read through many of the newspapers of the time, that the situation in Georgia at this time was very much touch and go. Who was going to hold power? A lot of the soldiers, Soviets, were passing resolutions demanding the re-election of all the Soviets, which they imagined would lead to a far greater representation of Bolsheviks, and the possibility that the Georgian Soviet organizations would recognize the authority of the Council of People's Commissars in Petrograd. And Jordania was absolutely dead set against that. So all the Georgian Social Democrats were sort of, using their massive majorities in the existing Soviets to ensure that there were no re-elections of the Soviets at this time, the end of 1917, early 1918, because they didn't know what the outcome was going to be. And the People's Guard was crucial in putting down various bits of civil unrest. So, in the absence of a functioning police force and in the absence of a functioning army, this group of armed men was, I think, crucial in ensuring that police, such as it was, remained in the hands of the leadership of the Tiflis Soviet rather than sort of either dissipating completely or coming into somebody else's hands. So it was a small but crucial organization. I would contend it was one of the main organizations on which at some critical moments, particularly in the early days, the power of the Georgian Social Democrats rested. Had they not had this body of armed men at their disposal, they could well have been swept away despite the level of sympathy they enjoyed in the population.
But if I remember correctly, too, one of the uses of the People's Guard and Jugelia that became the most controversial beyond just the suppression of these demonstrations to, uphold the power of Jordania and the Social Democrats was also in regards to some of the non-Georgian ethnic groups in the territory. So I remember in your article you had written about how they were even celebrating these expeditions to suppress various non-Georgian rebellions within the territory. Could you just describe what that was about, what those were, and the kind of significance that this kind of dynamic played in the trajectory of the First Republic, sort of moving away from these sort of social democratic and internationalist ideals into something else?
Red Guard became the People's Guards in June 1918. So when Georgia after Georgia declared its independence and had therefore established, if you like, more traditional state structures which were going to take over from the Soviet power structures within Georgia, led by much the same people. There was a question of what to do with this Red Guard, which remained politically important to the Georgians' leadership. And they decided to turn it into a state institution. That's when it ceased to be the Red Guard and became the People's Guard and became a state financed and officially established paramilitary force operating alongside the nascent regular army. But it wasn't answerable to the Minister of War. Djugeli had ensured that the People's Guard was answerable to the head of the government, which was Jordania from the end of June 1918. So this body then took part in military operations within Georgia alongside Georgian troops, but not subject to the same kind of discipline as the regular army, not in most cases trained in the same way that at least the officers of the regular army had been. In some respects, it served almost in the same way as the same way as the political commissars attached to the Red Army in Russia operated, ensuring that the officers of the official Georgian army did not start trying to act against the revolution as Djugeli and his comrades saw it, but also it was a fighting force that took part in a number of the military operations that took place on Georgia's borders. Now, the first and worst of these, in many respects, was the war with Armenia that broke out at the end of 1918. Armenians believed, not entirely incorrectly, that the Georgians had, in May 1918, saved themselves by cutting a deal with the Germans to protect them from the Ottomans and throwing Armenia to the wolves, leaving it to the mercy of the Ottomans. And there had been all sorts of border incidents on the south in the Lori area, where there was a plurality of Armenian inhabitants. Whether the area was mainly Georgian or mainly Armenian was disputed. And following the foundation of the Armenians, the end of the war and the sort of the establishment of a more coherent Armenian polity, war broke out between Armenia and Georgia over these disputed areas, using a lot of the grievances that had built up amongst the Armenians about the way they perceived they'd been treated by the Georgians at the time when the Georgia was a German protectorate. And so Djugeli and his men were sort of fighting there. And it's very interesting if you look at Djugeli's book, Tjozoli Krest, A Heavy Cross, how he presents it as, these Armenian nationalists are kind of, trying to sort of push their nationalist claim against our kind of internationalist, revolutionary, socialist sort of polity, and how this is very dangerous for the friendship of the peoples and all of that sort of thing. But by the end of 1918, he's celebrating their seizure of various Armenian villages and talking about making giving the Georgians New Year's presents of bits of border territory, and at the same time, this is on the front line where the People's Guard is operating. At the same time, internally, the People's Guard was heavily involved in basically rounding up Armenians. There's a kind of internal ethnic cleansing that was taking place within Georgia, in Tiflis in particular, because prior to 1917, the largest single ethnic group in Tbilisi had been Armenians. I think they made up about 45% of the population. And because many of them had been involved in trade and that sort of thing, and were therefore more likely to have the vote uh, in the pre-revolutionary system, the local politics was very much dominated by rich Armenians. And so, if you like, class struggle within Tbilisi as well as national struggle was necessarily tied up with these kind of ethnic contradictions. Once the Georgian-Armenian War had broken out at the end of 1918, effectively, the gloves were off, and the People's Guard and others were involved in expropriating Armenian property, seeking to drive Armenians out, arresting them, and all that sort of thing, humiliating them. And it was really quite an ugly and inglorious episode in the history of the People's Guard, its participation in these sorts of actions. And then subsequently, and this possibly has a longer term, but certainly has a longer term impact. In 1920, when the Ossetians in South Ossetia were restive, and Bolsheviks from across the border were seeking to exploit their grievances with the Tbilisi government in order to sort of foster insurrection against it. The People's Guard was deployed in operations to crush the South Ossetian rebellion, and already it was by that time the practice of burning down the settlements of places where they'd found insurrection was quite well established. The first reports of that as a tactic in People's Guard operations was in 1918, proudly reported in the Social Democratic newspaper Barba. By 1920, it was well established, and the suppression of the South Ossetian rising was brutal and fairly indiscriminate. And even the Georgian general Kvintadze, who, okay, admittedly, intensely disliked Jurgeli and the People's Guard, writing in his memoirs, pointed out, drew attention to their particular kind of undisciplined ferocity and cruelty in the way that they dealt with the Ossetians, compared, in Kvintadz's presentation at least, with the properly disciplined way that the regular troops under his command behaved. How they really behaved, I don't know, but that was his presentation. And subsequently, the South Ossetian separatists have rediscovered Jurgeli's book Jejoli Krest and used it to very good effect in underpinning their claims to separation from the Georgian state. Look what these people did to us last time, and that sort of thing. I don't know if you've seen the South Ossetian propaganda film Iron Vande. And talk about low budget movies is extremely low budget, and its presentation of Jurgeli is, it presents him as nothing more than a kind of a bloodthirsty psychopath. But it starts with somebody reading through a copy of Jejoli Krest and underlining certain passages where Jurgeli is describing their actions against the Ossetian risings in 1920. It still forms under sort of the kind of the main underpinnings, ideological underpinnings of the South Ossetia's kind of claims not to want to be part of a unified Georgian state. So Jurgeli has got this kind of posthumous notoriety of a sort he never expected to have, and certainly never intended when he allowed his diaries of these campaigns to be published.
On the one hand, they're kind of celebrating some form of internationalism, but at the same time, you've got in the social democratic newspaper this celebration of the kind of like anti-Ossetian campaigns or the deportation of Armenians, and I guess I think that's kind of interesting because um, it just seems like one of the recurring themes is that there's this tension that exists between the sort of stated internationalism and the functional nationalism of the First Republic. So it's interesting to see how the association of these various non-Georgian minority groups, which is the same sort of rhetoric that will be taken up by Gamsahurdia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that sort of associates these non-Georgian groups as being somehow counter to an internationalism that doesn't really fully exist, or counter to the Georgian national project. They're kind of like, I want to say, ethnicization of a kind of internal enemy, and that to me is it's just interesting to know that they were sort of celebrating that, and that also even the way that you were describing Jurelia's the way he was sort of framing his own understanding of why he was leading such expeditions was for this. It's not entirely clear if he was, some firm believer in internationalism or some firm believer in the, a functionally nationalist project. So it's interesting to see the way that they were interacting.
Well, I don't see any reason to doubt his subjective sincerity that he did believe in socialist internationalism and all of that. It wouldn't be the first example of a radical socialist engaging in this kind of doublethink and self deception when it's expedient to do so. I mean, you know, Jugeli presented the Armenians as counter-revolutionary bourgeois nationalists who were attempting to undermine Georgia's revolution, and the Ossetians as basically, I mean, he described them as the watchdogs of the old regime and that sort of thing. So basically, counter-revolutionary. You know, well, enemies of revolutionary Georgia that have been kind of tricked or deceived by malevolent Bolsheviks and or white guards from outside into taking part in risings. I mean, it's always a problem for socialist internationalism is that unfortunately political cultures up to the present day remain national. And so the acceptance, the widespread acceptance amongst the ethnic Georgians of Georgian social democracy and that type of politics didn't spread in the same way to the Abkhaz. It didn't spread to the Ossetians, and that sort of thing had different political cultures and different sets of references and interests, and were receptive to different sorts of ideas. And this is always the problem when trying to organize a state like Georgia that has these quite distinctive national minorities within it, with quite distinctive cultures and that sort of thing, is that there's absolutely no reason why they should be in step with the political culture of the dominant nation. And so, the question therefore arises: do you somehow seek to dilute the politics that the majority have signed up for within your nation to accommodate the politics and the cultures of the minorities, or do you seek to oblige them democratically to go along with what, after all, the majority in this polity seem to want? How you resolve that one, I don't know. I don't think anybody ever has really found a particularly satisfactory resolution to that conundrum. But it's not one which is if you like, specific to Georgia or the experience of the Democratic Republic. It's come up time and again. I think particularly if the politics of the majority is a politics of radical social transformation, which is like far more likely to sort of meet resistance than a kind of a politics of steady as she goes, small c conservatism that is altogether not involved in trying to change people's lives quite so much.
Didn't people also want radical transformation, expropriation, and class war as well? Because, as you said earlier, that there was a reining in of class war, right? At first, the Mensheviks were trying to keep it less about that and more about building the nation. But then there was a turn with the Armenians, and as you said, it very much is class and ethnicity were also tied together. Armenians were the bourgeoisie, but there were also Georgian bourgeoisie as well, and lords and so on, and nobles. Did the Mensheviks ever go after them? So how would you like say this was not a race, not sorry, ethnicity thing, right? If the Mensheviks did sort of let go and like embrace the class war, then they would go after the Georgian nobles as well. But if they only go after the Armenians, then it looks more of an ethnic instead of a class sort of fight. Or maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Maybe what do you think about that?
Well, it seems to me that, I mean, the Armenians, I think, were disproportionately represented amongst the kind of merchant and sort of capitalist class. The Georgian nobles, as I understand it, were predominantly a landowning class. And there you've got the whole question of land reform, which the Democratic Republic was, I believe, trying to pursue an equitable land reform. The problem always is with land reform. At what stage in the agricultural cycle do you carry out your land reform? It carry out, if you like, if people are expecting that what they plant they're not going to be able to harvest, they're not going to sow, and so on and so forth. So it's always if your concern is to keep your food supply going, which in a country at war is always necessary, then your concern also is to institute a land reform which is going to be perceived as just and equitable and isn't going to lead to civil war within your own country, which is also disastrous if you're at war with your external neighbours and your food supplies from abroad have been largely curtailed. It's quite a difficult one to do. So as I understand it, the Georgian state was attempting to introduce a land reform to bring about a more equitable distribution of the land amongst the peasantry and break up the noble estates and that sort of thing. But that was taking place in a different. It was a different sort of campaign and taking place in a different sort of way from the, to a certain extent, spontaneous campaign against the Armenian bourgeoisie in Tbilisi. So it's to be honest, I don't know how far they actually got with the land reform. Certainly in some parts of Georgia, some of the rebellions they had were from peasants who were dissatisfied with the speed of the land reform. And some of the rebellions they had were from instigated by landowners who were kind of dissatisfied with the fact of the land reform. So I dare say some work has been done on exactly how far they got with it. I'm not familiar with it, and I'd very much like to know.
So have you seen Their Kingdom, this small documentary? the propaganda against the First Republic?
I have not. Who?
I'll send it to you. Actually, I videotaped it, and when it was showing, it was actually hid. I think lost and recently found.
Right.
But the characterization of it's kind of like memes, you know. I feel like nobody really gives credit to Soviet Union having like sort of almost meme-like propaganda films where they have like writings and like jokes and so on.
Mm.
And so it shows how the the First Republic kept a lot of the hierarchical structures intact, like the rule of the church, you know, all the nobles. They sold, they had all these like armies march in, you know, like the foreign armies come in, and then our precious sort of mineral resources sold to foreigners controlling it, or you know,
Mm.
and having like showing like toiling workers still going on, and then these like mines being operated by the, you know, foreigners. So like that's sort of a depiction, and then they talk about how this is not really democracy, and criticize like every word, right? It's not
Yeah.
social, it's not democratic, you know, it's not.
Yeah.
And so like since you haven't seen it, I'm giving you a picture of what it is. Would that be a fairly accurate description of what's happening? Or is, of course, it's still like, you know, propaganda, maybe overly blown. But what do you, how would you assess that, just that description of the First Republic?
So is this something produced in Soviet Russia or
It's by
in
Georgian, it's by a Georgian director who made it. But it's during the Soviet Union. It is produced
yeah,
during the Soviet Union, but it is by by Georgian filmmaker.
yeah. I mean that was the standard presentation that the Georgian Bolsheviks were making of the of the Georgian Menshevik regime, that it really didn't change very much, or didn't change as much as it should have done, and that it was altogether too soft on the traditional power structures within Georgia, um, including including the church, but also, you know, including the traditional landowners and that sort of thing. How true that is, uh, I don't know. I mean, from what I've seen, where I've been able to sort of verify things independently, it seemed to me that the, the 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 Georgian Social Democrats' presentation of what they've been doing and their support has been far too kind of glowing and optimistic, and the Georgian Bolsheviks' presentation has been propagandistic and you know, generally, how can I put it, hypocritical, denouncing their enemies for doing much the same sort of things that they were doing when it was expedient within Soviet Russia. You know, the loss of the peasants in Soviet Russia and the loss of the peasants in democratic Georgia. I mean, I wouldn't envy the loss of either of them at that time. You know, it's you know, there was a definite propaganda war going on, in which two regimes, which in some respects were well, because of their common ancestry, if you like, not that dissimilar, were denouncing each other and portraying themselves as the polar opposite of one another. And if anything, that's one of the sort of the overall points of the work I've done, looking at Bolshevism, Menshevism more generally. They were far more similar in terms, well, necessarily as a result of their common ancestry and common assumptions and that sort of thing, than either side cared to admit. So, you know, the Mensheviks in exile's reinvention of themselves as these consistent Democrats and supporters of democratic values and human rights and that sort of thing is a little way off the mark, to put it mildly. And likewise, the Bolsheviks' presentation of themselves as, you know, the defenders of the interests of the workers and all of that sort of consistent, fearless revolutionaries is also doesn't necessarily stand up to scrutiny when you look at their actual record. So it's you know, I very much like to I very much like to see these. I suspect from the way you describe it, it sounds very similar to the books by Trotsky Between Red and White and Filipe Macharadze, his description of the Menshevika dictatura, which came out in 1921, 1922. So it's you know, those sorts of themes.
Yeah, there's a interesting phenomena. I don't know if Brian in the beginning discussed it, but you know, there's a fetishization of the First Republic by, you know, let's say very few scholars, because in general they try not to remember any socialist content. But though there are few that actually also discuss the First Republic and the socialist content of it. And it's interesting because it's often deployed as an anti-communist way, right? Like they're only interested in the First Republic because they're trying to fight communism and try to show that apparently without communism, Georgia could have achieved, well, there were communists mostly, so I mean, pretty much. So like, but they have this like idea that without the Soviet Union, that, you know, everything would have been great in Georgia. And then this like wonderful, it's sort of like how we may also fetishize the Paris Commune, you know, that kind of thing with the First Republic. But it's always deployed to be anti-communist. It's never like taken as like, okay, well, that was good, and also this is good, and they had similarities, and this was a different context, and that was another context, and so on and so on. Has to be always put against communism. And of course, because also, I mean, the Mensheviks were also at the same time anti-communist, anti-Soviet, before there was the Soviet Union. So what would you, I guess, make sense of this, since they're very similar and they're doing similar things? The NEP kind of looked like Georgian social democracy, and the fact that the Mensheviks were very liberal in their use of violence, and they were also the first to actually kill the Bolsheviks. You know, the first of the actual murdering each other thing started in Tbilisi. How would you put all of this like in perspective of how would you not, I guess I'm asking, like, how could you appreciate both without having to counter them against each other in a historical sense for today?
Well, I mean, first of all, from my point of view, I'm not looking for heroes. I'm looking to understand the actions and motives of people who, overall, I'm sympathetic to what they were trying to do. I can try to appreciate. I want to try to appreciate the dilemmas they faced and why they responded in the way they did to the situation they found themselves in, given their intentions. So yeah, I mean, I take your point that the presentation of the Democratic Republic by those Georgians who want to sort of, you know, make it as part of their national myth, and of course, you know, its constitution, which they never actually implemented during the First Republic, then became the you know, the constitution of the Second Georgian Republic after 1991, and so on and so forth. So it's this kind of source of historical legitimacy, a kind of an illegitimate source of historical legitimacy, if you like, because the social content of the intentions of the founders of the First Georgian Republic is completely lost. So yeah, the political political use of the First Republic in Georgia was very interesting. In 2013 I attended a summer school brief on organized at the State Archive on the First Republic, and that was fascinating because there many of these scholars were present and were presenting, and some of them took the socialist content seriously, but for many of the presentations, it did seem to me that you know the big story was the establishment of Georgian nationhood, and the attempted social content of the First Republic was just this aberration. Sort of just one of the sort of the peculiarities of the times. Everybody had to claim to be a socialist. That was just what it was like in those days, and we've all grown out of that now, sort of thing. So a very distorted view of what the First Republic was. But overall, I think a theme of the work I've done, historical work I've done for most of the things I've ever written, have been looking at how, if you like, ideals and reality have have met, and the problems that has created, and the fact that we're dealing with ordinary flawed humans who are trying to cope with situations where really the implementation of their ideals is not possible. If you consider the visions of socialism put forward by the classical socialist theorists of the Second International, and then look at the actual concrete situation which existed in the ruined, defeated Russian Empire of 1917, 1918, it seems fairly obvious that there's no way that you can implement that splendid vision of a cooperative, relatively harmonious, solidaristic, productive, society of welfare and that sort of thing in those circumstances. You're the difference between the kind of the vision and the motivation of the socialists and the material reality they face is just so massive that you're not going to get if they manage to realize even a part of their programs, it's quite amazing. Let alone if they manage to realize a lot of them. This has been, if you like, one of the intractable problems of the socialist movement since its inception, that the circumstances in which socialists have tended to come to power have never been the circumstances in which they would have been in a position to do what they came into politics to do.
Orjonik ide Stalin coming back to secure Georgia into the Soviet Union, what then became the Soviet Union, was like continuation of the sort of Bolshevik Menshevik fight war that they had been going on in Georgia. It just took on a much more let's say transnational characteristics. Will happen to be transnational because after 1917, but really was part of the same empire right before it. So because the Mensheviks from the beginning were much more clever, and they outmaneuvered all the Bolsheviks and removed them from many of these revolutionary committees. They won the people over. I won't say won the people over, sounds like it was some democratic, like I think they were just outmaneuvered very well through these like elections and from a smear campaign that the Mensheviks started against them. So they get maneuvered out, which the rest of Russian Empire doesn't happen, but it does happen in Georgia, like you said, sort of an exception. And Stalin, at some point, like, you know, he has to leave. Like, Georgia is no longer a space he can operate in. So he leaves and continues on his work. And so I look at it as also a part of a longer battle between the Georgian Mensheviks and the Georgian Bolsheviks, because of, you know, Georgian affair, and also Lenin sort of not being down with this in the beginning of the Red Army invading and like forcefully integrating Georgia. At the same time, also, it's an internationalist project. So I mean, it's like the whole thing is to go international. So that I'm just a nation building, and Stalin and Georgia being such a small place and being used as also could be used very effectively against the Soviet Union. So I understand like many reasons why you'd want Georgia back, you know, to be in the Soviet Union. So what do you think about that? And I see it now again, because Georgia is a small country. I see with the former president of Georgia, Saakashvili, using the same things as Stalin in some ways, you know, except he's just not powerful or as Stalin was, and smarter, and doesn't have that kind of hegemony. But, you know, he lost in Georgia. He's outmaneuvered in Georgia electorally. He lost over and over again elections. So what he's doing is literally going to, like, he went to Ukraine, right? So get stronger in Ukraine and politicize Ukraine. He's using, you know, every contact from Georgia, from the U.S. to Ukrainian government, to the U.S. to the EU, to destabilize in domestic politics in his favor. So he's clearly using, you know, let's say outside of Georgian forces to have influence inside Georgia. And it's easy to do when you're a small country, like, and are in sort of wrapped up in all these different, you know, nexuses of power. So there's two things, not two, I guess it's like part of one question. What do you think about this premise of this sort of explanation that I have? I have a small sketch.
I think you need to look at over the whole context of the Civil War in Russia, the post-revolutionary war in Russia, in which the Bolshevik territory, which at one time by 1919 was reduced to the area of medieval Muscovy, reconquered all those bits of the Russian Empire which were, if you like, economically less advanced than the Russian heartlands. It's not accidental that the bits that they didn't manage to reconquer, Poland, the Baltic states, Finland, are the ones which, if you like, in terms of, you know, Marxian type concepts of progress and that sort of thing, more advanced. And the areas they did manage to reconquer, the Caucasus, Ukraine, Central Asia, were, if you like, less advanced. Georgia is an exception. It's one of the last places that they retook. It wasn't militarily necessary to retake it in the same way it was necessary to sort of take Central Asia and other areas where the White Guards were operating. It was taken because they could, because the local Georgian Bolsheviks wanted that outcome. And would it have been possible to have coexisted with an independent Georgia, at least after the Treaty of the 7th of May 1920, when the Georgian Bolsheviks were re-legalized and there was diplomatic recognition between the Georgian Democratic Republic and the RSFSR? Yes, it probably would have been possible to continue with that, but there were various people in the Bolshevik leadership, including people like Stalin or Johnny Kidzé and that sort of thing, who, you know, regarded the DRG as an aberration and an abomination, and they liquidated it because they could. Yeah, I'm sure they genuinely believed that for the interest both of the Georgian proletariat and of the world proletariat generally, that liquidating the Democratic Republic of Georgia was a good and correct a good and correct thing to do, but it was part of an overall pattern of regathering the Russian lands, if you like, that took place during the Civil War, largely on the principle of nature abhorring a vacuum, that it wasn't until effectively pretty much all the old Russian Empire was brought back under Moscow's control that the Civil War came to an end. So I think those are the main driving forces for the process, of which the reannexation of Georgia was one of the last acts, apart from the mopping up operations in Central Asia. It had a particular piquancy because of the fact that, unlike in Central Asia, unlike even in Azerbaijan or Armenia, it also mirrored this decades-old, well, 2 decades-old factional battle that had been taking place within the social democratic milieu, which wasn't an issue in Armenia, wasn't an issue in Azerbaijan, for example. A kind of rivalry that existed. Now, okay, Jordania's government sailed off into exile. As I understand it, quite a lot of the lower level Georgian social democrats who had been serving, living in Georgia and serving Jordania's government, swapped their allegiance, reinvented themselves as Bolsheviks, and carried on. So the Georgian Menshevik emigration, which ended up in Paris, was quite high power. It had some the leading figures in it, but most of the people who had been in the Georgian administration, quite possibly members of the Georgian Social Democratic Party, remained and switched their allegiance. And I think, to a considerable extent, the Bolshevik authorities were very happy for them to do that and encouraged that process in the same way that they did in other parts of the Soviet Union. So how much of a difference on the ground the changeover made in the short term, I don't know. Possibly, almost certainly not as much as either the Georgian Social Democrats in exile or the Bolsheviks like to make out at the time.
I mean, one way that I kind of understand it is that once this, yeah, exactly what you said, that most of these people who had been serving in the Menshevik administration or the Jordania's administration just go on to work for the what will become the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic in the Transcaucasian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, but that also others have written that these initial years, the Bolshevik administration gains quite a bit of legitimacy because, of course, after they establish power, this is a period that now peace and some level of stability over the next few years essentially comes for the first time had been in the past 5, 6, 7 years, which is also, I think, an important factor. One thing I kind of wanted to bring up that you mentioned too, which is a question I had, is that you mentioned that, of course, after Sovietization, the high-level officials of the, Jordania Democratic Republic of Georgia government leave, and of course they create what is, like, I guess we can define as like an oppositional nationhood in exile. And you had written in your article that this kind of romantic view of the DRG sort of aligns with the emigre interests. And they maintain this oppositional narrative to the quote unquote Soviet occupation. But it's interesting the way that you just framed it, because kind of like the way you're kind of describing it now is like, a lot of those people who ended up leaving and creating this government in exile, really the highest kind of crust of the government, whereas the majority of people inside of Georgia are just like, well, yep, next government's here, and let's keep going with what we're doing, or so there's going to be some policy changes, but let's keep this thing going. So I'm interested, like that's kind of a very different narrative than somehow it's presented, right, as being this huge shift and change. I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Well, I mean, for those for whom national independence was the big thing, of course, it's massive. They've reincorporated into the Russian Empire that now calls itself the USSR, and that's the end of the national independence. And once again, they're kind of their local figures with the real power kind of located outside of their republic. For those who weren't particularly hung up on that, and this was the thing about the Georgian Social Democrats, is that their nationalism was, if you like, a response to circumstances rather than being something they were particularly keen on, in its own right. The change, well, yeah, it's an end to the war. That's no bad thing. Normal trading relations, or some kind of trading relations with the grain supplying areas across the Caucasus Mountain, are restored. That's no bad thing. You've got mechanisms for sorting out your interethnic relations between you, the Ossetians, the Armenians, and that sort of thing. That's no bad thing either. There were lots of advantages to the Sovietization of Georgia, as you said, in that it brought stability. And similarly, although the Bolsheviks in Georgia were a relatively small group, so I mean, people who had if you like to understand it, a Bolshevik past in Georgia occupied all the top positions, but that doesn't give you enough cadres to run. So a lot of people, from the the previous social democratic administration, well, who else have you got? So you've got the new Bolshevik authorities needed these people in the same way that these people remaining in Georgia needed jobs and needed to find some way of carrying on with their lives, which is possibly one reason also why the rising in 1924 was abortive. That the proportion of Georgians who were prepared 3 years down the line to risk everything in an attempt to sort of have a rising and overthrow Bolshevik power. Zhugeli returned secretly to Georgia in order to attempt to be one of the leaders of that rising. It was a complete fiasco. It just did not have the support. There was certainly a hard core that was up for it, but this was not the kind of the mass support they imagined that they had, for the reasons that you've, I think, outlined.
So both in the early 20th century and the beginning of 21st century, or actually the end of 20th century, seems like the independence is like the last thing. It's usually circumstantial to get independence. Like it's sort of by accident almost every time. There's never like a demand. It's always about like self-determination and certain, autonomy. And then both situations sort of the Russia decided, Russia fell and then they like got independence. Yet what's interesting is, and so it was never really part of the program so much, right, as I understand what you're saying. And yet in almost all of the mythology that exists, it is only reduced to the independence part. It's like out of all the entire program that you can choose, you can discuss, that was actually not in it. That was given by circumstances is now upheld as like the fight for freedom, for independence, and somehow that's like number one. And even now, like we have people who write, even our podcasts, like don't even call it Soviet Georgia, like we were like, it doesn't exist. Soviet Georgia was under occupation. And so like all these kinds of like things all the time like are written and discussed, and the way it's discussed is like, incredibly disingenuous and part of this like very right-wing nation building. I guess like what would be like, because we're kind of running out of like, I think time, it's been a long time we've been discussing, and I've been like patiently listening. I've really, really enjoyed your discussion, Francis. I want to say I really like the way you present things. I like the way you speak about things. So thank you so much for being with us. And I was just listening in the beginning and not asking so many questions. I guess like maybe do like wrap up comments, because we can like continue on for another hour if you like, but maybe we can do a couple of things that a lot of people don't know and would help them in context, because our listeners enjoy our podcast and they're learning so much. And so I think it's important for things that they may not know, that really could lift almost the veil from a lot of like sort of fuzziness about history that's sometimes so strange, like you can't put it together. And this one fact or some one comment sometimes can like unravel, and you can clearly see the first time, So maybe there's like something you can give us like as a last comment, or maybe what was, so when you were doing your research, what was so striking to you, maybe, what made you be like, aha, had like eureka moment for you?
Well, one of the things is, I think it's worth taking away is precisely the point you've just made, the contingency and accidental nature of all of this. I mean, Georgia became independent because its leadership in 1917 rejected the Bolshevik seizure of power because they hoped that the Constituent Assembly, which was dissolved for internal Russian reasons in January 1918, was going to establish a constitutional framework which would allow Georgia to develop as a nation within a democratized and reformed Russian polity. And it was Russia's descent into civil war after that, which effectively obliged the Georgian authorities to become independent, because they'd already kind of they'd lost all their other options. The dream they had in 1917 of a different constitutional settlement which would allow Georgia to develop nationally without the Tsarist era limitations on the nation's cultural development, but as part of a wider Russian policy, was effectively wrecked in 1917. And so that is the thing. It was the title of the piece I published in 2018, Improbable Nationalists, had a better title when it was translated into Russian, Nationalisti Panevolie. So it's not that they intended to become the sort of the creators of a nation state, but this was kind of more or less foisted upon them. And similarly, in 1991, although Gamsa was a fairly rabid nationalist and that sort of thing, it was above all the Russian proto-capitalist elite around Yeltsin using the RSFSR structures to seize power and wreck the Soviet Union from within as part of their own power grab, which sort of scattered the other Soviet republics effectively to the four winds. And so, the role of accident and contingency in pushing Georgia to, if you like, this position which was never intended by its own political leadership in if you like, in calmer and less turbulent times, independence, it was always a desire for, if you like, greater national autonomy, greater national self-determination within a wider polity. And I suppose arguably you can see it in a kind of distorted form in Georgia today, where everybody just claims how much they love the EU. A desire to find a substitute, an alternative for what they had or could have had or imagined they might have as part of a reformed Russian Empire. Unfortunately, the internal politics of Russia at the moment are such that Russia cannot serve as this kind of pole of attraction, which is very regrettable given its geographical proximity. But so it's I think that's one thing which we can, I think, take away is that the mythologized version of this, whether it's the official Georgian national narrative that this was Georgia's first attempt at becoming an independent state as demanded and required by the broad masses of Georgia with this peculiar socialist ideology which we can forget about, or the kind of Menshevik mythologization of the wonderful socialist democracy that was created in Georgia that was snuffed out by the Bolsheviks, which has recently had this kind of mini resurrection in the book of Eric Lee. The important thing is to look beyond the myths, look at what actually happened and why, what was constraining people and obliging them to make the choices they did. What did they think they were doing? The other thing is, as I said earlier, no more heroes. We don't need to sort of mythologize or sort of put anybody on a pedestal as an example to be admired or emulated or whatever.
Guardia, ferma,